my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Jolivette Anderson-Douoning is a PhD candidate in American Studies and currently serves as the inaugural Edmundite African American Fellow at St. Michael's College. Her research focuses on race, space, and place, and the lived experiences of Black women and Black families in segregated neighborhoods of Shreveport, Louisiana after World War II. I'd also like to add, in chatting with her, she seems like an amazing human. She has a teenage daughter, and she's still here tonight. So let's give her a round of applause.
Oh, and my daughter will never look at the recording, so we don't have to worry about that. First of all, good evening. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules to come out in this weather to hear what I have to say about Mrs. Goldleana. And we have this tradition in African culture. I have to ask if there is anyone in the audience, if you don't mind acknowledging your age, who's over 70 years old. I have to ask you for permission to continue because you are considered an elder in my culture. So do I have your permission to continue? I was just asking if there was anyone over 70, I would have to ask for your permission to continue. That's a part of an aspect of African culture and that we do sometimes at programs to acknowledge and honor the elders in the room. So, yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So what we're going to be, you're going to have to tell me when to stop.
Okay.
Okay.
Never.
What we're going to be doing today is I'm going to be sharing work with you from my dissertation, a chapter of my dissertation, and then we're going to have a conversation. And that conversation can take whatever form you'd like to take. I'm open to questions. There's not too much I haven't heard in doing this kind of research. So that's just to give you a little plan of what's going to happen. As you're listening, if you have any questions, please register them and we'll have a conversation about them later. And I have some visuals that I'll bring up about my research and some primary sources, as I am a historian working at St. Mike's in the history department during this dissertation fellowship that I'm on. As I was driving the other day, I kept asking myself, how do I want to present myself to you all? I did not know what you would look like. I did not know who would show up for this event. But what came to me is reflection. Think about yourself and who you are and what you've been doing for the last whole 30, 40 years of your life. And there are two things that I know that I am. I am definitely African American, and I'm definitely Southern. And so when I think about how Southern I truly am, no matter how many different states I've lived in, I'm born and raised in Louisiana, I lived 10 years in Mississippi, I lived 16, 17 years in Indiana, I gave birth to a Hoosier. My daughter was born there, and then we came to Vermont and we've lived here for the past year and a half or so. And I consistently hear myself speak, my words, my phrasing, the sentiments I have, things that just pop up out of me to my daughter as she looks at me really crazy. And I was like, you know what, I'm a very Southern woman. And so, an epistemology of the South, that word is just a big word that means, how do we know the South? What do we want to learn and how do we know about the South? And what am I going to share with you that will give you insight into what it means to be Black and what it means to be Southern at the same time. And I'm going to do that through the teachings of my grandmother, Goldleana. She left a historical document for us to share with, for me to share with you all today, right? And special thanks to all who made this possible. So this lecture is actually a continuation of the lecture I did at St. Mike's College last semester, and it was called In Goldleana's Hands, Black Women and Labor Choices in Cattle Parish, Louisiana in the 1950s. And the imagery here that you see is an image of Miss Goldleana, and that is also Miss Goldleana with a cute little chubby girl sitting on her knee. I wonder who that little chubby girl might be. I don't have prizes to give away if you can guess, but feel free to guess. Chapter 4 of my dissertation looks at 3 historical positions connected to Black labor from the perspective of a Black woman and her family's labor practices. Cotton production in Northwest Louisiana, Black labor in larger context of workers' rights and unionizing in 1950s Northwest Louisiana, and the role of cotton work in the self-liberation acts of a Black woman whose labor by choice as a hand-picked cotton field worker and a timber industry worker was connected to her understanding of herself as a human being and as a citizen of the United States of America in her formal labor, as evidenced by her informal practices. So within this chapter, formal labor results in the income earnings made by Mrs. Goldleana, and then it is used to access opportunities in other areas of human activity and achievement. So basically that's a fancy way of saying when you go to work, what do you use your money for? And what you use your money for tells us something about what you value or what's important to you. The contents of her ledger provide economic data from Mrs. Goldleana's earnings from her formal labor practices. The economic data is the evidence used to map historical moments of generational and racial uplift, colloquially called pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps. Mrs. Goldleana's labor in the cotton and timber industries in Northwest Louisiana exists as a ledger in material form. The writings written are evidence of her work habits and her work ethic. This included keeping a written record of her labor practices, income, and expenses. She documented her work location, income, and expenses from 1949 to 1957. While living in Caddo Parish, her documentation begins in Keithville, Louisiana, and covers the years 1944 to 1949. It continues when she moves from Keithville to Shreveport, Hollywood neighborhood on Ledbetter Street. I'm sorry, on Hollywood Avenue initially, formerly called Fairfield Place Subdivision. She lived and worked the remainder of her life on Ledbetter Street, and that street was previously called 3rd Street, from 1950 to 1986. Mrs. Goldleana's ledger as a primary source provides a look into the history of ordinary people. It gives historical insight into rural living and describing how Black people earned money, made a living in Northwest Louisiana before, during, and after World War II. The income and expense record of Mrs. Goldleana's ledger focuses on how she earned her money and how she spent her money, thereby describing in part how Black women's labor contributed to racial and economic uplift of one Black family that can be traced from cotton fields to historically Black colleges and universities and to predominantly white institutions, or PWIs, over 3 generations in Northwest Louisiana. There are also mysteries. Anybody like a good mystery? I'm a BritBox girl myself. There are mysteries associated with one expense that is documented in the journal, and I'm going to share that with you because I think some of you may be able to provide me some additional insight after the lecture. This one expense will require additional research beyond this dissertation. In Mrs. Goldleana's ledger are payments she made on October 5th, 1952 to a Mr. Murray Moak for, quote unquote, the everyman relief. Here's what she wrote. I paid Mr. Murray Moak $4.30 for the everyman relief. $2.15 for Papa, $2.15 for me, Goldleana Abraham. There was another entry about everyman in Mrs. Goldleana's ledger, but it was spelled with a lowercase e. When it was spelled with an uppercase letter E and had the word dues after it, the meaning was different and required additional inquiry. So I'm giving you an insight into how I had to approach looking at this handwritten journal from a Black woman who was living in who was born in 1920 and writing this journal in the 40s and into the 50s. Sometimes in the South, we write things how they sound, right? So this is, if it's relief, we may spell it I before E, step after C, that kind of thing. But she wrote it like leaf, L-E-A-F, because that's the leaf that she was familiar with. So I had to basically decode it in order to be able to find the meaning in it. All right? So the word relief was spelled relief, R-E-L-E-A-F, and once understood to be relief, R-E-L-I-E-F, it became clear that Mrs. Goldleana and her father were regular dues-paying members or contributors to the Everyman Relief Fund. What was the Everyman Relief? It became a mystery when the possible answers based on research included the following. 1, a reference to DC Comics. I wasn't expecting that. A reference to DC Comics character named Johnny Everyman that was used as propaganda to push the anti-war principles of the East-West Association founded by Arthur Pearl S. Buck. I really was not expecting that to find that there, right? And number 2, a borrowing of the name Everyman as a name for a fund that black people paid into as life insurance policies or mutual funds. So additional research found that there was a fund that black people did pay into. Some of the elders in my community confirmed that for me in conversation, and they said that it was really for burial insurance, because at this time, black folks were not necessarily having opportunity to purchase burial insurance or life insurance, right? So they did have these community funds that you would trust someone to pay into, and then if something happened to you or a family member, you had that money there, and they would help you bury your people, okay? So internally, inside of segregated spaces, there was a different way that money had to operate and had to function for black people to basically survive and uplift themselves out of the conditions that they were in. Because we're still talking about people who were emancipated, but still trying to figure out how they fit into the overall national system that is the United States of America, specifically states below the Mason-Dixon line, specifically Louisiana, specifically Caddo Parish. All of those geographical locations will mean something as it relates to the reputation of the place, the people, what they believe, and the levels of violence that were present, everyday violence that was present. So black people had to basically comport themselves in certain kinds of ways. A sidebar, I have been in, relationships up into including my now ex-husband, where my expectation for relationships connect to this. Because when I grew up, my parents were married 40 years, and if we ever left the house, if my mother left the house, we left a note on the table saying where we were going and when we'll be back. And what I didn't realize was that this was protection. This was so your people will know who you are, where you are, and when to expect you back, because black people were coming up missing. They just disappeared because of the levels of violence. So it was not safe to be out after dark, right? And things of that nature. So when we talk about relationships that I was in, the expectation is that you come home by a certain time at night. And unfortunately, my ex-husband did. That's another story. I hope he don't watch this. All right. Anyway. All right, so back to point 1 and 2. If either one of the points I just mentioned is factual, right, in whole or in part, history of the everyman ideas and principles may connect to some level of organizing in local and global communities. It is not a far leap away from the black communities and its existence of agency to find that the name and principles of everyman were present in Keithville in the 1940s and into the Hollywood neighborhood in the 1950s. A study of Mrs. Goldleana's ledger demonstrates that people in these spaces had a political and intellectual position on the racial discrimination they lived under. Was there something about the everyman character or the organization that helped create it that attracted hardworking black folk who were conscious of the environment they lived and understood they had to prepare for their future? Mrs. Goldleana's ledger provides additional clues when she wrote about attending a union meeting. This entry confirms secondary source confirms and states that women, quote unquote, women took an active part in the union at both the local and state levels. Often more literate than men, They performed valuable services like writing letters, passing on information from printed sources, keeping records, and teaching other members how to read and write. Further research will investigate to find connection, if any, between the Everyman Relief dues and the critical internationalism efforts of the East-West Association, author Pearl S. Buck, and the DC Comics character Johnny Everyman. The use of Mrs. Goldleana's labor to support efforts to improve the lives of Black people via a relief fund as a dues-paying member or contributor can give us insight into the intellectual thoughts of Mrs. Goldleana and Mr. Willie, her husband. It can be used to tell if she was conscious of her surroundings and the white supremacist beliefs about Black people being inferior. Perhaps the notion of being used by society as laborers while not being seen as full citizens invoked a response, a hidden in plain sight response that is visible when viewed through liberation framework that includes Black people organizing around their interests from within segregated spaces, rural and urban, in the 1940s and 1950s. So I have 3 historical positions that I deal with in chapter 4 of my dissertation. I'm not going to read all 3. I'm going to share pieces of historical point number 1 and historical point number 3 because they fit best with this theme. Historical point number 2 does deal with unionizing and unionizing work done among tenant farmers in the state of Louisiana. That work did take place, but our educational system doesn't necessarily, well, not necessarily, let me be real. Our education system doesn't look at history from the people's perspective, right? So we tend to look at heroes, holidays, and timelines, but we don't contextualize it to ask who were these people, how did they get to this place, and then begin to ask what impact did their lives have on the greater good of the nation, right, as a whole, and how does it connect to what we think democracy is and democratic values and principles are as well. Y'all with me so far? Okay, so historical point number 1, the history of the migration of Black folk from rural Louisiana into urban Louisiana during the time Mrs. Goldleana had documented runs alongside developments in cotton production. So what I'm saying here is that her migration from rural to urban connects to the fact that farming practices were changing. Let's continue, and that's my next line. Farming practices connected to farm size and access to technologies to plant and harvest cotton on large plantations. Plantations, as we think of the word plantation, is usually associated with slavery, but plantations still exist today. A plantation is just a large farm, okay? A farm with large acreage is called a plantation. All right, so I know I'm from the South, and these words roll out of my mouth very easily because it's just like, I wake up and can say plantation and it not be a problem. But some people have a reaction. So I want to be clear about the language that I use. And there will be some language. It's not the hard N-word, but I will use language from a trajectory of identifiers that African Americans have been called, but not the pejorative ones. So just to let you know, all right? Some of my students, they have a hard time with that because they haven't been taught the history. So I just want to make sure everybody understands. Cotton production was important to specific industries as well. Its usage in products before and after World War II and its textile competitors in the 4 apparel fibers sent to domestic meal consumption was a continuation of its historical uses in apparel industry as well as automotive industries. The 4 fibers are cotton, wool, silk, and rayon. In the late 1920s, cotton was the major crop being sent to the mill. So there's a whole, I'll just read it, knowledge of the step-by-step process for how cotton, a plant, becomes clothing apparel, as well as industrial uses in automobile, truck, and airplane tires. In the 1950s and into present day is necessary to understand how Mrs. Goldleana's documented labor practice is part of an economic engine that ran the state of Louisiana. while at the same time her labor, her income and expenses are part of the economic engine that ran the upward mobility of Mrs. Goldleana's family and was integral to understanding how labor impacts culture, right? How your job impacts how you live. Lived experience, culture, lived experiences and opportunities within segregated spaces in North Louisiana. So let me pause here and define for you the segregated space. So segregated spaces have a legislative origin in Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case of 1896. And that is when they said that when Mr. Plessy, who was black, but he was able to pass as a white man, but somebody who knew he was black, he intentionally went and sat in a train car to see if he could be arrested and if that arrest case could go up to the Supreme Court, and it did, right? And the ruling then was that there was no harm being caused by separation of the races in public transportation. So our good folks in the South, right, took that and ran with it after they had been, I think at that point, about 4 or 5 different constitutions in the state of Louisiana that were trying to identify how the state was going to run itself, how the people were going to govern themselves in the state, all the way from when it was Louisiana Territory to the very first constitution in 1811, 1812. And then it moved on to 1845, where they became more structured, and then it moved on to 1852, and by the time it came to the Reconstruction Constitution of 1868, which was right after the Civil War, that Constitution had black delegates that were there. There's images of them all over the place, and that Reconstruction Constitution was the one that every other constitution since, maybe the exception of the last one, was fighting to get rid of that. So it was like, okay, we're going to be a state and everybody's going to be free and everybody's going to have public education and we're not going to separate people based off of race and schooling and all these other areas. And then the 1896 Louisiana Constitution that kind of coincided with that Supreme Court says completely wiped out everything they were trying to do in the 1868 Constitution. Right? And they had arguments embedded inside about how to actually suppress black people and stop them from voting, right? And one of the things that they did was say, okay, literacy. If you can't read or write, you can't vote, right? And then when black people said, well, education is what we're going to do, it's important, we're going to learn to read, write, and cipher, right? Cipher being mathematics, right? Add and subtract, count your money, basic skills, right? And when black people were hungry for this education, they said, well, education then is only going to be a temporary barrier. We have to find something that can really bar people from exercising their right to vote, to participate in the franchise, right? So the disfranchisement meant, okay, let's make it a property qualification, an educational qualification and a property qualification. So if you can't read or write, that's one thing. But if you don't own property, if you can't prove that you own $300 worth of property, you're disqualified from participating in the franchise. You're disqualified from voting. But what that did was also to disqualify many, many, many poor whites at the same time. So it's like you cut off your nose to spite your face, right? And so that was the predicament that folks found themselves in Louisiana, particularly throughout the state, but particularly in North Louisiana. I digress. Well, I didn't digress, but let me move forward. Okay? All right. Within the historical gap is Ms. Goldleana's labor and the records of her labor in Louisiana cotton fields from the 4th week in August to the 1st week in December from 1949 to 1957. That is what she documented in her journal, all right? And I call it a ledger/journal. It's not the images of a person sitting down and eloquently writing something, she's writing down these things that happen because part of me wants to think she's practicing her writing. Another part of me thinks that was the way they had to keep records for themselves, for their own protection as well. So these are people that are thinking and planning and organizing their lives, But if we've been taught certain kinds of history, we tend to think that black people didn't have these kinds of skills and didn't care at all about planning and organizing their lives. And that is where the problem exists, even in the present moment, because some of these beliefs about black people are still present. So here I come, right, with my grandmother, with my grandmother's information from the 50s and my life experiences, and I'm like, this is important. And so I travel and I talk to people in Louisiana, and the people at the Louisiana LSUS archive in Shreveport say to me, we don't have hardly any information in the archives about what happened in black neighborhoods. Because we're talking about segregated spaces. And it's a black-white binary in the South. If you identify as anything other than black or white, you're invisible, okay? Segregation was rooted in you're either black or you're white, all right? So imagine my experiences in Mississippi. They may have been similar to some things in Louisiana, but when I moved to Indiana, I'm like, whoa, okay. And I'm in West Lafayette, Indiana, for Purdue University is where my dissertation's from. And then when I moved to Vermont, and then I'm like, whoa, okay, wow. And that's a good, wow, that's a good thing. Indiana was good and bad. We'll leave that alone. Okay. I'm getting in trouble with the Hoosiers. All right, they need to tell me what it means. That's my problem, right? Don't tell me I'm a Hoosier and you can't tell me what a Hoosier is. And come on now, y'all gotta be with me. It's like you gotta have qualifications to be a Vermonter. You gotta tell me what a Hoosier is before I say I'm a Hoosier. Okay, there you go. All right, so in the interest of time, let me do some other adjust some things here. So basically, for point number one, historical point number one, the need for laborers is connected to the role of cotton work in the life of a black woman who labored by choice as hand-picked cotton field workers. When I say by choice, that's a tricky word, right? Because you either work or you don't work, right? There's only certain jobs that are going to be available to you as a black woman, right? And so there were organized washerwomen that were black women. There were field workers, right? But other jobs, and there were black women trying to work really hard to get education to become teachers, right? And my mother became a teacher, by going to historically black college, Wiley College in Marshall, Texas. And my dad went to historically black college, Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So there's these structures and systems that are set up, but they're connected to segregation. They're connected to the laws of the land. And so when we ask ourselves, when we say we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, to establish justice and ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common defense, to promote the general welfare, to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, right? We ordained a constitution that was supposed to live up to those particular ideals, and embedded in those were principles. But for who? Or is it whom? I forget. Any English people in here?
Who?
Thank you. For whom? Right? I'm glad I had sense enough to ask the question, right? Right? So that's what I want us to think about when we think about the South, when I say an epistemology of the South. How do we know the South? What do you know about the South? What do you know about black people in the South? Because all of us didn't leave. All of us did not migrate to Chicago and New York and to west to California when Truman opened up the defense thing so black people could actually work in the defense industry. All of us didn't leave. So we hear about the migration and the stories, but what about those of us who stayed? And my roots on my father's side go back to the 1830s in Louisiana, in North Louisiana. I plugged so much stuff into Ancestry.com after my dad died, they called me. Like, thank you. And now there's a whole section of black folks that's Northwest Louisiana, and people are finding they're connected to people from all over the country from all that information. Because my grandfather was an old man when my dad was born. He was 66 when my dad was born. Yeah, my grandfather was born in 1870. He was born 5 years after the Civil War ended. my grandfather, not my great-grandfather, my daddy's daddy, right? So that longevity makes me have a little different perspective on things sometimes, because I was raised by old people. And that's a good thing. That's a good thing. All right, because I'm a talker. I told you I'm going to skip over historical point 2, which was about unionizing, but I do want to bring your attention to historical point number 3, because it's the role of cotton work in self-liberation. So to work or not work, that's the choice. Mrs. Goldleana decided to work. She decided to work in the areas that she had skill, and she also decided to work in areas that where she could get a job. And those things were in North Louisiana, in Caddo Parish, that was cotton work and work in the chair factory or in the lumber yards. Because that area had 200 years of pine, that was virgin forest. And there was lots and lots of trees being felled and all of this. And even, it was nothing to see when it was, on the way to church, those big trucks with all the logs chained up and stuff. When we were on our way to church, there were all of those trucks going back and forth from one place to the mill, right? And so that's where she and my step-grandfather worked. She worked in the chair factory certain months of the year, and she picked cotton from August to December. And she wrote down how much cotton weighed. She wrote down how much she got paid each week. And then she wrote down other activities of her life that demonstrated what she paid, what she used that money for. And in that, the actions of the ledger and her life, you began to see the uplift. So she moved from being a tenant farmer, right, with her second husband and 3 small children, into them working together to be able to move into the city, right, from rural into urban. So I'm gonna actually pause and pull back a minute and let you see this document. So this is my Mrs. Goldleana's handwriting. So you see here, April 5th, 1948. So at this time, she's still living in Keithville, Louisiana. And so she was born in the village of Longstreet, Louisiana, which is not far from Keithville. And she was born in 1920. That same year that she was born, there was a Rosenwald school built. So the Rosenwald schools was this Rosenwald fund. I think it's Julius Rosenwald. He gave Booker T. Washington them this money at Tuskegee to build all these rural schools. And there's one in DeSoto Parish in Longstreet, Louisiana. It was erected the same year that my grandmother was born. So I'm making the assumption, because I don't have documented proof of her early education, so I have to assume that she went to that school, but I cannot prove through evidence that she went to that school. But the school is actually still standing, believe it or not. That school is still there, and I came upon it by accident. I was driving. Every time I see a historical marker when I'm traveling, I stop, and my daughter's like, not again! No, Mama, we gotta stop all the time. That's she's like, just give me a minute, just give me a minute. She hates it, but anyway. All right. So she says here, got $20 from Mrs. Gillum. April 19, 1948, got 10 from Mrs. Gillum. Put 4 sacks, and this word threw me for a minute because I can't understand what it is. So I had to take some time to figure out what is she talking about. Put 4 sacks of something under corn. And I was like, what did she put? It's fertilizer. Okay? All right, so it is $2 a sack. July 10, 1948. Mrs. Gillum let Will, that's her husband, have $3, 6 sacks fertilizer under his cotton, and it's so old it's torn right here, but we just are able to figure out cotton. So in 1948, they're growing their own corn and their own cotton on Mrs. Gillum's property. Okay? So Mrs. Gillum is loaning them money so they can get the fertilizer to put, and they have to pay her back that money. Right? So what this is saying also is that, number one, she can add and multiply, right? Education-wise, she can write, she's literate, right? So when it comes time, if black women were allowed to had to take the literacy test, she'd be able to do that. She can read, she can write, she can cipher, right? And she's obviously a planner and a thinker because she's doing the administrative work required for that fertilizer to get to the up under those crops, right? And so you have to think about this in those particular terms to be able to understand that what she's doing is liberating, because she's pushing back. Just by living her life, she's pushing back against a narrative that black people can't do these things. You understand?
Yeah.
All right? And so Mrs. Gillum, upon further research, because some of these folks are still alive. They're in their 80s, and they remember these people. So my Aunt Roxy referred me to a person in the community, and she remembered my grandmother, she remembered my mother, and my aunt and uncle, and she told me who Mrs. Gillum was, right? Mrs. Gillum was a black woman who owned land. So what you have to understand is every time we talk about a plantation or a landowner in the South, black people owned land. The land in my grandfather on my dad's side, he's had it since 1904. It passed down to me and my siblings now, and it's going to pass down to my daughter, right? So we have to kind of uproot some of the stereotypes that we may have, and we all have them, including me, right? So there's no shame at all, you know? So we have to kind of uproot some of that to understand that there were industrious, hardworking people. Some of these folks in Louisiana, you know, we got names for folks. So Mrs. Gillum, either her or her mother were mulatto. So in Louisiana, mulatto means one parent is black, one parent is white, right? So then in Louisiana, we're gonna take you all the way down to 1/64% blood and then the one drop rule, all right? Because you got that Creole thing in South Louisiana. Our constitutions, the first 3 or 4 of them were written in English and in French. All right, so you have French, African, Spanish, and European, those mixtures, right? And so, as far as Mrs. Gillum is concerned, it turns out that Mrs. Gillum was Mrs. Goldleana's second husband, Willie Abraham, related to him, okay, in some kind of way. So there are these networks of families in these small rural areas where everybody kind of know each other. You either go to church with these people or you're working with them in the field. So instead of saying this was a sharecropping situation where people were being constantly cheated out of their money and, oh, you bought, you know, you got sick and I had to pay this, and people never could get ahead and save and make their way up out of that situation, she was working as a tenant farmer on land owned by a black woman related to her second husband. So they were able to work and save up enough money, because by the time they moved to the Hollywood neighborhood in the city of Shreveport, they had enough money to have temporary housing, and then they had enough money within days of them moving, relocating, to go and put a deposit down on a dirt lot where they would eventually build their own home. Okay? So when we talk about uplift, right, when we talk about racial uplift and economic uplift, that's what this ledger, when I decoded it, that's what it was, right? And I know my sister will never watch this, so I'll talk about it real quick. When my mother died, when my mother passed away, my sister was just taking all stuff and just putting it on the curb for the dumpster, you know, the people to pick up, right? I was like, you know, you need to chill. You need to stop doing that, because I need to go through this stuff and figure out whatever. And so she take it to the curb. I go get it and bring it back under the carport. I go look somewhere, do something, it's back out there on the curb. I'm dragging it back up under. I said, you know, we almost came to fisticuffs about this, right? So I'm like, stop doing that, all right? Let me look at this stuff. And while I'm yelling at her, bloop, the ledger pops and falls down on my foot.
Wow. Oh, wow.
Yeah. Stuff like that happens to me. Don't ask me why, right? And so I was like, this is Medea's handwriting, right? By the way, Medea is a term we have been calling grandmothers long before Tyler Perry. Please understand that. He's actually from Louisiana, so Medea is really, you know, really real, right? Okay, so when you look at this, I just want you to think about the things that we've talked about, especially if you have any questions. Let me put the next one is. Let's see what the next one is. So this is the move right here. So that was 1948, right? This is January 2nd, 1949. And it says, we moved to Shreveport to Hollywood Avenue. Helen them start to school January 3, 1949. March 11, we move in our own house. paid Reverend Williams $5, don't know what this word is, still can't figure it out, owned the house. January 8, 1949, Willie Goldleana, that means her and her husband. Okay? So she says, Willie Goldleana, that's not her name. She's saying Willie, who was her husband, and Goldleana, she put them together like that because they working as a team, all right? Willie Goldleana bought a lot, cost $450. That's how she bought $450. Paid $150. Leave us owing, she said, because black folks, we have this thing in Louisiana, we're going to switch up the vowels and the consonants of words, okay? That's just what we do. Don't bother us back, okay? But instead of owing, it's owing, right? So I had to figure that part out. I was like, owed. Oh, she means owing, okay. So once I got that, they owe that money, right? The February 1st, 1949, paid $60 on it. The light is kind of weird right here, it's reflecting, but bottom line is by July 1, paid for it, paid it out, paid for the lot. So from January 2nd, 1949 to July 1 of 1949, they had resources to buy a dirt lot, put Helen them, she had 3 children, Ernest, Helen, and Rosie. So when we say them, the young kids say, mama, them, they're saying one person and a group of other people. It's some other folks that are unnamed, right? And so you have to break down black vernacular and how we talk. We'll have a whole conversation about, so what does that tell you about what was going on? What was she doing to earn money? Did they have that money when they came, right? So they had to have some resources, but what was the work she was doing? Okay, she tells us the work that she was doing. Right here. You come over here. Right? So March 21st, 1949, I was hired. It says hired, but she means hired. Okay? Hired. That's the black vernacular. I talk like that at home sometimes. My daughter just looks at me real strange. She's like, Mama, say orange. I say orange. Mama, and I do it intentionally. I know how to say orange, right? But sometimes in just conversation, it'll come out, pass me the orange. Mama, I said, okay, orange. Oh, anyway. So I was hired to the chair factory, okay? Start to work March 22, 1949. I'm sorry, 49. Will got hired in Kenrod March 21. So they immediately started looking for work and got jobs. Because at this point, what is the nation doing? It's coming back from the war, World War II, and it needs what? Laborers, it needs workers. And what else is transitioning in the nation? We're moving from agriculture to what? Industrial, right? Machine, instead of people in the fields, these cotton picking machines are being developed. But at this point, some of the farmers in Louisiana haven't purchased them. So they're still using hand-picked cotton labor. Okay? So this is her documenting her life, but for us, we're like, aha, there's the transition from field to factory that we hear about so much. Documented. Okay? Documented. All right? Oh, I can't see. Give me a minute. August 27, 1949, I bought a radio. $19.50. $19.50, I think it is. And this is important because if you know anything about Louisiana, if you ever heard of the dude named Elvis, or you've ever heard of, oh gosh, what is his name? Jambalaya, crawfish pie, filet gumbo. Him. I can't say his name right now. He got a son named after him too. All right. That's a junior. But anyway, there was a radio program that started in Shreveport, Louisiana. Does anybody know what that radio program was? Very popular back in the day.
Is that the one with Hank Williams on it?
It was Hank Williams' song, right? He was on this, they had this program. Yes, ma'am. Thank you. If I had a prize, I'd give it to you. Yes, ma'am. Okay. The Louisiana Hayride. The most popular show. Oh my gosh. So when I asked the elders, like, what did y'all do for entertainment? What was your leisure? You know, what did y'all listen to? They said, we sat around the radio and listened to the Hayride. We listened to Louisiana Hayride. So when you think that black folks wasn't into country music and it's all the things that were going on, you were sadly mistaken. Okay? They listened to what was coming through the radio, including the politics. Earl K. Long would be on some of those programs, the governor at certain times talking about stuff, and black folks was listening. And if they are listening, we have to understand the agency of folk. If we understand that something is going on in society, we're asking the questions, how is it going to affect us? Because remember, Cattle Parish was called Bloody Cattle because of the violence, right, that was going on. So black folks don't believe that we were all nonviolent and peaceful. Nonviolent until you mess with us. Is this phrase, don't start none, won't be none? Can't use the expletive because it's being recorded. But if you don't start no mess, it won't be no mess. We're going to be peaceful unless you come for me or my family. Then it's not going to be peaceful. So black folks had guns. We had guns for protection of family and property, but we weren't out there trying to threaten people and all that kind of stuff with them. It was what I consider real Second Amendment rights, right? I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, she says the first, August 23rd, I start to picking cotton. The first 4 days, I made $20.40. Okay, so if you go over here, next week, I looked at those, August 23rd, first week, August 23rd, 4 days, 2040, and August 2020, that was $230.74 for 4 days of work. So what can you do now with $230.74? Today, she could have done that with $20.40 back in 1950. Okay? And if she was saving that money, which she was, because in her journal she documented when she had $1,000 in hand. She documented, I got $1,000. That was a lot of money for 1949, right? They weren't going to McDonald's and eating out every day. They were cooking. And in the neighborhood I grew up in, everybody that came from rural areas into the neighborhood to find jobs and work, all them folk had gardens in the backyard, growing their own tomatoes and, growing their own food, right? And my dad actually owned a couple of cows. So if he killed one of his cows, we had something called a deep freezer, where he would have a butcher do the meat and they'd wrap it up in that white paper, label it, and then he'd freeze it. And we'd have food in there for months, right? And so that's how folks were living. So what happens in my grandmother's journal is that she tells us, you have to give me a time check. How much time do I have?
10 minutes.
Really?
It's all right. No.
Okay. I'm doing a remix in my brain. Okay, let's do one more of these, okay? Because I want to give you all time to talk, right? She's talking here about cotton picking in one day and what she made. So this is more stuff. But what I want you to pay attention to is this. This is September of, I think that's, good grief, I think that's 49. Well, here's April 17, 1950. Mr. John started building on my house. Right? So from January 2nd, 1949, she's been working at the chair factory and picking cotton. And she's got enough money to get what she needs, because they've already paid for the lot as of July of 1949. But it took them to work and make money, and he started in April of 1950 to building the house. All right? So this is step by step. You see the patience, the determination, the progress, right? And that is the house that I remember, because she babysat us while my mom and them was at work in that house, right? In that house. So when we hear the stuff I'm not even going to share with you, but the documented proof in Donald Yakovin's book about Fitzhugh and all these folks that had these theories and ideologies about the quote-unquote Negro or the African, right, and their brain capacity, and they shouldn't be allowed to vote because, they're not literate, or they're not this. So everything that they said we were not, my grandmother's journal proves that they were liars, right? And that how do we, right, begin to recognize these segregationist tactics, first dehumanize people, say that they're incapable, right, when the proof is here that they are. How do we uproot that from our psyches? Because it's not just white supremacy affects everybody, doesn't matter what color you are. There are plenty of black people that believe that some black folks are inferior, right? So how do we have conversations? How do we have tough conversations about that? And what role, I don't know what role my dissertation work is going to take, but I do know it's a local history, and I'm just going to begin there and make sure that the stories that I have uncovered, I'm going to make sure that they get told, and that the voices of the elders in my community who are still with us and those that have recently passed, that they get told in some way, form, or fashion. And I thank my grandmother for being my grandmother. Questions? This is your time to talk. Oh, good, hand. Hey, yeah.
Well, I have to just say I had a schizophrenic upbringing.
Mm-hmm.
My people are from Goldleana, Louisiana.
Oh, hey!
Better for worse. And I went there every year,
Mm-hmm.
which was very confusing because I was growing up in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And every year we would go to Goldleana.
Wow.
And it was very challenging to do that. And I just have to tell you one funny story. My grandmother worked at a Five and Dime in Goldleana. We went there. I was whining, 6-year-old, I was thirsty. She said there's a drinking fountain around the corner.
Mm-hmm.
So I went around the corner, one said colored, one said white. I was very excited because I thought colored would be Kool-Aid.
Exactly.
I'm from New York, so, Kool-Aid was woo, and I wasn't allowed to have it at home. So I was fired up. I went to the colored fountain, and I was just discovering that it wasn't Kool-Aid, and so I was disappointed when some other woman came around the corner and started screaming at me because I was drinking from
the colored water fountain.
From the colored water fountain. And I totally didn't get it because it was exactly the same. The
exact same water.
So what was the big deal? And I still remember my grandmother. She had a hard time, but she was trying to explain it to me. And I, as a 6-year-old, I just didn't see it. And when you're 6, everything has to be fair. And it didn't seem at all fair. And my mother had a mammy, Cora, who we visited every year. Had to get dressed up. We went to Ora's house. We had to sit there. We couldn't say anything while my mother visited. And then we left. But it was...
That's the culture of the South, though.
Oh, absolutely.
That is the culture of the South. Yeah. And remember when I told you about the words? How many of you was like, oh, she said colored. Oh my God, she said mammy. That's the South.
Yeah.
That is the history of the South, right? And there are these families, right, that had black people working for them as domestic workers. And my grandmother actually did. My uncle, who's still living, who did yard work for white families.
Yeah.
And there was a code. There was a code that you had to abide by.
Yeah.
And it was an unspoken code that had been passed down for generations. Like, there is no way that if a white person is asking you a question and wanting you to agree with something, that you're going to disagree. You're not going to disagree. And they would use something that you say to prove, like you standing there with a gun asking a black man a question and he's just smiling going, yes, yeah, well, yeah, And he's doing that because he don't want you to shoot him. Because you could shoot him and kill him and there will be no consequences for it, for you shooting and killing him, right? And so that is the environment. But what I want us to focus on is these liberating acts of just being alive and living your life and resisting that I am a human being. I'm not what you and other people have been trying to scientifically even prove that black people are. Now, I don't think my grandmother knew anything about Darwin, and maybe she did. I don't know. I don't know if she knew anything about that. But I do know that what she did know, she was determined to live her life and have something to show for it. Okay? Have something to show for it. So I have a lecture on the 13th. I'm going to see you right there. I have a lecture on the 13th on Louisiana learning and public education and the Constitution of Louisiana, and that's going to be at St. Mike's College on the 13th at 5:15 to 6:30, April 13th. So is that next? I'm tired. Yeah, it's next week, isn't it?
Yeah.
I loved what you said about that often history is taught by the, as from the famous people,
Mhm.
and that it's important to be able to tell. I just love what you're doing with this in that it gives us, or the people who are exposed to it, a personal attachment to the larger stories.
Mhm.
And so, there's some people that can remember facts and figures and all that kind of stuff. For my way of learning, there has to be a story to be able to have a hook to
Mhm.
hang the facts on.
Yeah.
And this is just wonderful. Kudos to your grandmother and to you. It's really amazing.
And the fight in me, my sister.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
ma'am.
if I can piggyback on what Catherine was saying.
Yes, ma'am.
I think what you're doing here is so vitally important, because you have the combination here of within our memory of the documentation, the primary source material that all historians
Mm-hmm.
lust for,
Mm-hmm.
and the family stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I so much appreciate your willingness and your passion to wed these and present them and share it with other people. But I'm also, as I'm listening to you, thinking, how do we translate this into some kind of
Mm.
curriculum for,
Mhm.
say, middle school children
Mm-hmm.
to learn this?
Mm-hmm. It's hard because even as I do some consultant work at Winooski, with Winooski schools, because that's where my daughter goes, and it's hard because, and even for college students, because I'm having conversations with college students about the word Negro, and they don't want that word used. And I told them, if I can't say Negro, I can't teach history, okay? Dr. King says it in his speeches, Malcolm X says, this is an identifier, it's not a racial slur. It's an outdated term. I wouldn't just walk around referring to black folks, African Americans as Negroes now, right, or color. We wouldn't do that now. But as in the context of talking and teaching history, yes, that is a word that black people refer to themselves as, and that's its own census records and all this other kind of stuff as well. And my brother, I was born in 68. My brother was one was born in 71, one was born in 73. 1968 and 71, our birth certificates say colored. My brother in 73, born in 73, his birth certificate says race of parents, Negro. So within that amount of time, it had shifted. But as early as the mid-60s, black folks had started making the change, saying we don't want to be called Negro, we want to be called black, right? So you have this trajectory of identifiers from African to captive to slave or enslaved person, free people of color, then you have colored, Negro, black, Afro-American, now African-American. So that's a trajectory, and some of them are interchangeable. You will find black folks being referred to as Africans in documents and literature in the 1800s, right? And we didn't make that shift to African American until around early 80s, 84, 86, something like that, when it started shifting from black to African American. So I call myself black, my daughter says she's African American. You know? It's generational. It goes along with this thing about who people are and how they want to be identified versus what identity is placed upon them. And by the fact that my ex-husband is from West Africa, from Cote d'Ivoire, there are identity issues with being bicultural as well, right? So you have this identity where your mama got deep, deep roots in the South and your father is from Africa, right? So where do you land? How do you find your own voice in that? So that's what, in her teenage years, that's what's going on with her right now as well. So it's a lot. It's a lot. Questions?
The woman
No, but I think I might be able to find that information out from some of the elders. My uncle is in his early 80s, and my aunt, and the person they referred to me down at the church, she is in her 80s, and she may know. Matter of fact, there was a name that I told her about in the journal. She said, "That's my daddy." And I think that's one of the reasons why it's taken me so long to do my dissertation, because it's not just been an academic exercise, it's been a generational, spiritual, family exercise in trying to figure things out and then trying to present it in a way where Purdue University, a Research One institution, is going to accept it as a dissertation, right? And so that's been the challenge. But I can tell you that my grandfather, James Brown Anderson, he purchased 300 acres of land in 1904. He sold some of it during the Depression. He split some of it up with his brother-in-law, his first wife's brother, who was a man named Taylor. And that land is largely still in the family. So he was married 3 times. His first wife died, and my Aunt Sarah, whom I had a relationship with, she lived into her 90s. She was the last child of that first marriage, because her mother died in childbirth after she was born, right? And she was born in 1912. Yeah, and I had a relationship with her. I'll be 55 in August, just so you know, right? And so my dad, as I said, he's from the 3rd set of kids, my grandma Addie, and he's born in 1937. Yeah. And so just learning about the fact that these women were doing these things, and there were these partnerships, and my grandmother wrote about taking other people to the doctor and writing down what the doctor told them they should eat. You know, she had a vehicle. She had a vehicle. I have a picture of her holding my sister when my sister was a baby in 1964. We're in the yard with some neighborhood kids and that old 1950-something car. I found it through newspapers.com, librarian. You go in there, Ancestry, newspapers.com. I typed in my grandmother's address to this house, 5913 Ledbetter Street. And what popped up was they documented when there was a fire. So that car caught on fire on a particular day, and it's documented in the newspaper with that address. So that collaborated what my mother had told me about, oh, she had a car and it caught on fire. Just whatever. But I then found the proof that it actually happened in the local newspaper, newspapers.com. Right? So that's what a researcher is doing now with the technology, and being able to actually use the stuff that's out there as primary sources to connect the dots for some of the things that your parents say, but you know. And then my mother was like, oh, I used to go out there, and my grandmother, my mother had us out there picking cotton and all this. And I was like, okay, mama, whatever, right? And you just blow it off, and then you see in the journal, she had them out there picking cotton with her 2 weeks out of the year. And I think it must have been when school was out. It was always the same 2 weeks, sometime in September, they were always out there with her picking cotton. And then speaking of curriculum, and I'm gonna shut up. Speaking of curriculum, I came up with somewhat of a word problem. And I can't share it with too many people, right? Because if you use the term Negro or colored in the classroom, young people have a problem with that. But this particular word problem was, it said, this is my mother's name, Helen. Helen is my mom. If Helen went to pick cotton, you can't talk about picking cotton because that stirs up images of you being offensive toward black people, because our labor became weaponized against us. You a cotton picker. Thank you. Tell your granddaddy thank you for my shirt. Those have been things that have been said to black people to insult us because we worked in the fields doing labor, cotton field labor, right? Or as slaves forced to do that work. But there were plenty of white folks and all kinds of folks that was picking cotton because it was the #1 money maker. They used it for some of everything, not just the cotton itself, the seed, the plant, all of that, right? But anyway, so they went out to pick cotton, and Mother wrote that they made certain money, but then the next day they went out and they made more money, but they picked less cotton. And I was trying to figure out the math. I was like, what is going on? How could this possibly be? Because I thought I had made a calculation error when I was putting the chart together, putting these things together. And I said, you know what, let me go back to the original document. And I went back to the original document, and over in the margins, she wrote, "It rained."
Oh my God.
So the cotton was heavier when it got wet because it was seeded cotton. And so when they put it on the scale, it weighed more, so they got more money, but they made them stop working because they didn't want to pay that much money. And so when I give them and say, how could Helen make this much money on this day and this much money on the next day? What's the missing variable? And nobody ever guessed that it's the weather. It was the weather, right? And so it's little things like that that come out, but it's also a way of thinking that I was raised on. There's a certain kind of wit, a certain kind of wisdom associated with the people that brought me up, right? And I just hopefully can spread love all over the world with that, you know, for the goodness of us all. So, yeah. Thank y'all for listening to me. I appreciate it. I just feel so loved. Okay.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Enjoyed
Thank
it.
you.